So, hello everybody. I am here again with Jamie House. We had some technical difficulties that hopefully have been fixed. So, I know Jamie through the University of Edinburgh, which is where we both pursued a master's in some form of philosophy. So why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself again, and I know we're kind of repeating ourselves here, but let us know what you're doing and what got you into philosophy, and maybe what some philosophical problems you're interested in now.
I'll try to make this a little more concise because the last time we did this kind of went like way too back, I think. Anyways, I'm a teacher. I'm a Canadian teacher. I've been teaching overseas for 15 years. The area I've been teaching in is upper elementary. Right now I'm a grade 5 teacher. And I've always been interested in philosophy, as I was telling you earlier, although I always viewed it as a very difficult discipline to get into, but also one that's impractical. And that's not something you get a job with. Unfortunately, that's something you have to think about when you're a bit younger. I guess depending on your circumstances. But the type of teaching that I'm involved in is inquiry-based teaching, and I think it's quite of a slippery term that we use because a lot of teachers don't have this background in what it is to be an inquirer. Now, first and foremost, it'd be like science, but to me, like the most traditional form of that would be philosophy. And so, as it's kind of getting into it more personally, out of personal interest, then I was looking for programs that I can do by distance, and I found epistemology and ethics and mind at the University of Edinburgh, and I applied, and I got in. And my original interest was in philosophy of mind, which is where your interests are. But and actually, remember, I saw you in an Oxford continuing education.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Program. Yeah. And then we connected in Edinburgh. So, but funny enough, I never actually took any of those courses, any philosophy of mind or cognitive science courses in Edinburgh. I just ended up going into epistemology and ethics because I just feel that's more relatable to education right now, even though like AI and computational thinking is becoming some kind of buzzword type things that are coming about. But then even further in epistemology, and for those that don't know, epistemology is the study of knowledge. I mentioned the kind of study of knowledge in social context. So I suppose my area of expertise would be social epistemology.
Okay. And I know we had to do a dissertation. And I say had to. I obviously, I'm not sure you did too. Like there was a lot of enthusiasm for doing one. Not sure that the enthusiasm's still there after finishing it, but curious to know why you chose the dissertation you did, and maybe give us a little information on what that was, because I know it's related to testimony and epistemology. But for the specific question you had, maybe give us a little insight on what that was and why you felt you wanted to pursue that.
Yeah, so my interest, as grueling as philosophy can be, my interest, or my labor of love would have been is in testimony. So it's a pretty broad topic, even in epistemology or in social epistemology. The testimony is basically the idea that most of the knowledge we have is through the word of others. And my dissertation was about problems for hearer testimony, which is a kind of like a certain sense of testimony that a particular philosopher, Jennifer Lackey, describes in her concept of what testimony or what the nature of testimony is like. And so I'm arguing that you can't have, well, what I was attempting to argue is you can't have knowledge unless someone intends to give you that knowledge by either through their beliefs or via their words towards you. And what she was arguing is that, well, if someone just says something out loud with no intention of others learning, that you can still learn, that still can be conveyed as knowledge in some way. And I'm arguing against that last part. So
So how did you go ahead and tackle that? Because I know you intuitively you had issues with it. This didn't feel like it wasn't the disjunction wasn't necessarily correct. Was it something that you had been reading about and came upon the idea that this could be argued against, or was it something that you on the outset kind of had that intuition?
Well, I think the intuition it lies in. I mean, she has a whole project with Testimony. She has a whole book called Learning from Words. She wrote this in 2008. And there's a there's another aspect that relates to the nature of testimony is like whether testimony is via like transmission of one's beliefs to another, from speaker to a hearer or speaker to an audience, or whether the kind of holder of that piece of knowledge is just within the statements or the words that are being conveyed. Now, if you think of like a book or a history book that's written, say, 50 years ago by somebody, clearly you would gain that knowledge from their written word, not directly from them. But the idea was whether you're getting like there's like this beliefs view of testimony or statement view of testimony. And for Lackey, she lays in a statement view of testimony. But this can generate knowledge in some way, in some cases.
So it's the content of like, say somebody gives you a proposition or some communicative sentence, I like apples, and it's not the belief that's carried on that gives you the knowledge. It's literally the words that help form your belief. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think that's probably a more concise way of saying it. But the reason why I have issues with this, because I think we're kind of in this, what happens when lots of things get synthesized by other humans is that, a lot of their beliefs in synthesizing, say, lots of different statements, still has to be kind of pushed through with their kind of beliefs as well anyways. And given the climate we are in now, and say generative AI and things like that, I still feel like testimony still needs to be in the domain of an intentional speaker who is intentionally conveying information so that a receiver or a hearer or an audience can intentionally form their beliefs from what the other person's saying, or just have beliefs from the speaker transmitted into what they believe.
So somehow intention and meaning are linked in your view. Is that correct? So like you can have content that has a meaning, but it also could have, if there's somebody who's giving that testimony, they may have an underlying subtextual meaning in some sense, right? There's an intent, like sarcasm is a good example I can think of, like, oh, that was wonderful. Like there's obviously a different meaning that comes from that. And then there's that in itself validates something, well, what they really meant, because they intended on being sarcastic. They intended on using these words in a way that basically means the exact opposite of what they're saying. Is that kind of an example of something where intent is valuable and important?
Yeah, I think to me, like, intent is valuable because I see it as kind of, it's a governing thing that governs meaning. So so just kind of backtrack a bit. In Lackey's view, she has this dual sense to testimony, where it's like you can get testimony through a speaker that intends to convey knowledge or beliefs, but you can also get hearer testimony, which is, speaker just randomly says something, or what she calls does an act of communication for no one to coherently receive in any way. But still, since they've done that and someone is in earshot of that, they can, they can glean knowledge from that or belief from that in some way. It's, seemingly so, but I'm still trying to go against that. But what I'm saying is that I guess it would have to be an instance where it is true, you hear someone, but you don't. To me, there's like knowledge has to be governed by the intent of the speaker to know that they're conveying that to others in a way that is comprehensible, so that they would, gain their beliefs or receive knowledge from them in some way. And trying to lose the track here, but yeah. Anyways,
So what I'll take this moment to kind of just clarify for whoever's listening, which of course will be millions of people, um, the difference between speaker testimony and hearer testimony. Can you give just a quick definition of those two? Because I know we've used those terms a little bit, and I know that some might not understand why we say the hearer. Why would a hearer have testimony? Can you just give us a quick overview of what those two definitions could be or are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to read the actual formulation, but so I'll try to paraphrase it in a way that does the definition justice. So yeah, back to speaker testimony is that a speaker, the nature of that testimony, it comes from when a speaker intentionally conveys knowledge to someone, to a receiver or a hearer. Okay. They intend for that hearer to know what they know or to believe what they believe. Okay. Now, hearer testimony is the case where, a speaker still says something or conveys knowledge, but without the intent of anyone ever knowing what they said. It essentially is for themselves. So you think about examples like private diaries, I only write it for myself. A soliloquy where, Hamlet says to be or not to be, that is the question, whether it is nobler, thoughts out loud just for themselves. Really kind of weird kind of example, but if someone's overhearing that in the next room, just say, or someone sneaks a peek at someone's private diary, that's considered hearer testimony because there was no intention for them to know what is being conveyed in those words or in those acts of communication.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds great. That definitely makes sense. I think people get that pretty easily. So there's something that I mentioned to you a while ago about my dissertation, which was the idea of, if I can remember what it's called, it's basically when it's like the knowledge problem, which is that how do you know somebody is either. My example was it's based on joint attention, where this person is looking at an object and you're looking at the same object. You both know, and it's out in the open, that you're jointly attending to that object. And there's the issue of knowledge in terms of how do I know that person's attending to that? What mechanism, what epistemology is involved in me recognizing that that they are looking at the same thing, or so, for example, let's say somebody is looking at an object, and I have to either assume that they are looking at the object as well as I, and that they're, well, how do I assume that? Well, that they're looking in the same direction. Okay, they're looking in the same direction. Do their eyes work? Do they have eyes? And it becomes like an infinite regress. So for me, that kind of popped up when reading your dissertation, in terms of that's where intentionality, what intention is trying to, not intentionality, but what intention is trying to curb, is by being intentional in your communication, you're removing the assumptions that the hearer has to make, in a sense. Would you say that's kind of what's valuable about that, valuable about the intention aspect? And
yeah.
Would you argue for that?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense because basically what I argue for some of the cases of hearer testimony where someone just kind of I figure they're communicating something, to the universe or to existence or out loud just for themselves. But you have to do so much inferring. And I suppose you're relying on your own kind of reasoning, if it's I don't know, inference and perception, and these are kind of more traditional kind of things you speak about in epistemology is how you perceive propositions and whether it is true or it is, I don't know, I think you took epistemology because think about career cases. So I guess what I'm picking up from what you're comparing is like with when trying to recognize whether someone is attending to something the same way you are or towards the same object that you are. You're making a lot of inferences that they're exactly like you. Maybe it's an inductive reasoning that, well, there's a human and I'm a human just like them. So they must have all the same kind of interest as me and attention span as me. I guess sensory abilities as me kind of thing. And I guess I guess like if it's about recognizing what they're able to do, I guess like I'm not sure where that pairs with what I'm getting at, but I guess like intention puts the ball in the speaker's court to ensure that the knowledge that they are saying is like taken the way that it should be. Whereas if they're just kind of seeing it out for themselves, they can have all kinds of hidden meanings that are only comprehensible to themselves. And so they overhear in this case, the one that's taking the knowledge is not intended for them or for anyone else, has to really lean on inference and inductive reasoning in some way, and perception, I would say. So, yeah.
So there's a couple of things that pop up in my mind, which I don't think I want to go into now, which is the difference between observation and testimony, and how observation and induction and inference all play kind of they all have some similar role with each other. But I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more about what your argument against Lackey was in terms of the having a distinction or disjunctive theory. Because for me, it's very appealing to be like, oh yeah, there's that specific kind of testimony, and there's this specific kind. But it sounds like what you're saying that based on what we just talked about at least a little bit, that's very problematic. But is that the same problems that you kind of identify in your argument? Or tell us about what you identify in your argument to be the problem, or one of them.
I have a few kind of like leanings. Like there's one aspect that I think there are certain philosophers that are in her camp that just kind of treat, that just in a sense treat that person as an object. And if you're just kind of like assuming that what they said is, direct knowledge through the direct statement, there's nothing governing that except it's on the side of the hearer. They're governing whether that knowledge is being conveyed. I mean, they're relying on pretty strong, I'd say, inductive reasoning. And the counterexample I would mention that kind of is a big blow to my argument is, if someone looks at their watch and no one's around, or so they think no one's around, and they say, oh, it's 12:35, I better get on I better catch the train soon. If they're saying that to themselves and think no one's around, it seems pretty obvious that it's 12:35 to the overhearer. The person is just kind of eavesdropping, and that person needs to catch a train. So, okay, fine. But you don't know what's going on that side of that person's head. They're just an object. They're just a human. And a lot of other theories and testimonies, like trust is a governing thing, or the sense that you want your testimony to be reliable is a governing, or unreliable is a governing thing. You could certainly try to deceive someone with testimony, but you're intentionally deceiving them. But you're not treating them necessarily as an object. You're treating them as a person that needs to be deceived, an inductive reasoner, an inferencer, that needs to be received. So I don't like this source of beliefs view that a person is this object you can just kind of get information from. I feel like the ball, so to speak, has to be in the speaker's court, because they might
for it to be valid testimony. Or to be testimony at all.
To be defined as testimony. Yeah. And one thing that was brought up to me is that maybe it's just a problematic term, because testimony, if you think of testimony, um, the ones that's kind of common to the layperson to be like, well, courtroom testimony, you take the stand and you take an oath and you give your account of something, right? This is not that. This is really just about knowledge that's conveyed through the words, through words, not knowledge that is received through perception or, yeah.
So yeah, I think just a little bit earlier I mentioned the idea of observation and testimony, and I guess perception would be part of that. And you give an example before where somebody is reading a book and it's just words, and they can gain knowledge from that. So I guess where would because it sounds like there would be no intention that you're just reading an object that conveys information, but at the same time somebody wrote it, and probably with an intention. So is that something you would take into account as well? Okay, it's a book, you don't know who the author is necessarily, but they did write this with intention to communicate to others. It's not a diary. They're not speaking, they're not just writing a whole book for themselves, which maybe some people do. But so in that sense, that would definitely be an intentional communicative testimonial act, I guess, if act is the right word.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. Or a communicative act, you could call it. An act of testimony, sure, because what's governing it again is like they're trying to convey information to anyone who's going to read it, and they have to make sure that it's reliable or trustworthy, or that whatever they mean is conveyed to whoever the readership is, right?
Right. And I think that's where the regulation comes in, right there.
Yeah.
They're kind of working with like interhuman societal norms in some sense. Okay, well, what are the norms of communicating to others that are like me or that aren't like me? And how do we navigate that? So there's that big element. I guess it's a normative element that's important in testimony. How would, maybe normativity is not the right word. I'm again, epistemology always beat me up. So yeah. Normativity was part of that. It does remind me a little bit of, I guess like social normativity and how that's important for folk psychology and things like that. So I guess where I'd like to take it next is, and we talked a little bit, maybe it was on this, or maybe it was the one that had technical problems, where AI fits in that. Let's say I'm asking AI a question. This is maybe jumping the gun a bit. I'm asking AI a question. It gives me an answer. It has no particular normative aspect that I know of in it. It does filter, it's going through a bunch of stuff and saying that, I guess in some way, maybe it does, but it's not the kind, maybe I'll ask you that question. Is it the kind of normativity or regulation of information that we humans would provide as the speaker? I don't know how much you know about.
I don't know much about the architecture of large language models, but I imagine what's baked into them is like a linguist. They probably have linguists on their programming teams, and they do they use a lot of syntax, grammar and syntax to build their models. I'm assuming, and meaning with enough kind of examples, if you have a large enough data set where meaning kind of maps on top of all that syntax, then I suppose what is generated when you put in a prompt looks very comprehensible to you. And I guess if you do any tests of anything's a little more nuanced, like something deep in the weeds type of philosophy, large language models can't deal with that. They, if you talk about testimony, or if I asked the question that relates to my paper, like large language models can't make any sense of that.
I might have to push back on that, because I have actually played around with, I'm not sure which, it might have been ChatGPT 4, but they do a really good job of summarizing text. So like and because and some of the ways that those models do work is they just basically siphon the whole internet and they see what's most common or what word comes next, what word most commonly comes next in this context, and they do things like that. And they've had some summarizing of some things that this was luckily after I did the dissertation, or I would have been pretty upset with myself because it summarized some things way better than I would have, and I was shocked by how it wasn't super detailed because some of the stuff is, as you said, quite obscure, like at least to the general public, but because it is out there published, I don't know how much access they have to like philosophical journals and things like that, but I knew they do have quite a few ability to access a lot of stuff like that. It does come out as if it is well organized, well written, depending on your prompt, and truthful. And that's the thing. It's like kind of scary is that a lot of times if you dig deeper, it's not necessarily nonsense, but complete lies. Like they'll support their argument with links to these books, and you're like, oh, whoa, I'll click on this book, and there is no book. It just doesn't exist. So there's a lot of that going on, and that's very problematic because it's like a weird kind of testimony where it's like, here, this is truthful. I've given you the answer to your question, but then in actuality, it's completely false. It's fictional. But where does the intent come in? What is it just seems like it is a weird meta object of testimony rather than, like an actual speaker, but it feels like a speaker intuitively. It feels like a speaker. So it's just I wonder if you had anything to say about how crazy that is, because it's crazy.
I mean, that part of my paper is very much like, vanilla type social epistemology, vanilla testimony kind of stuff. But I do have this in the background, like, anything about not just GPTs that are out there, but robots have intentionality, and so part of what I'm maybe arguing for is there is this kind of level of just wanting to preserve that sense that, like, if someone misinterprets what you say, then you would be compelled in an interaction to correct what you meant to say, and that they receive it the same way. Or you anticipate that as a writer, that you don't want people to like misinterpret you. It seems to me that large language models, they just kind of do this predictive kind of thing, and maybe for like more common philosophy subjects where other philosophers have kind of summarized a previous person's argument, and that maybe that's something that the data set can kind of fake in summarizing. But if any like one singular philosopher's nuanced view, I'm not sure that they can like that necessarily can be conveyed. Not in my kind of tinkering around with things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that there's that there is that very important. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that it's a good showcase of how that intention is so important, because even though it can seem like it's trying to, as you say, self-regulate so that whoever's listening understands what I'm saying and gets the proper meaning, this isn't there in these artificial intelligent large language models. It appears to be there, but when you look further, you see that it's not there. And that's obviously, the problem is the speaker is really in control, from what I understand, in the testimony. And that's helpful because then they have to regulate what the hearer is intended to understand, what meaning is to be portrayed. And even though large language models seem like they are competent speakers, they are actually not. So we're deceived by that, and we relax on our, as a hearer, we relax on our inductive assumptions about what the meaning is. We just think, oh, this is what they mean because it's clearly they intended for me to mean this. And it's all false. It's like it's completely, there's no intent, there's nothing there. There's no checks and balances that the large language model as a speaker is forced forced to portray. Whereas in what you're saying is that's exactly why intention is important, because it puts a responsibility on the speaker. I'm assuming that's what the big issue is. It puts a responsibility on the speaker, and that helps in many ways navigate social norms and helps push meaning into a clearer avenue for the hearer to understand.
And it keeps it like uplifts it, keeps it on our social reality. It's like, language is so such a tool for ensuring, like, for conveying what our social kind of interactions are like with each other. And I don't see like a computer program having access to that. They don't know what things smell like. They might know the testimony, oddly enough.
Right.
Right. But super large. Yeah. Nice. So, but they don't know what the color red is. They don't know, they don't experience social reality as we do. And so I think like that preserves what I'm just trying to argue, what I'm trying to like do with intention of meaning in testimony coming from a speaker is kind of preserving that. And anything outside of that to me is kind of counterfeit. So I don't know if you read this Daniel Dennett article that came out, I think in the Atlantic some time ago, when he talked about counterfeit people and how it's bought. So that really resonates with me, what he was talking about. And even like we all do a lot of emailing with each other. I've seen people email me what is clearly a ChatGPT generated letter with pleasantries, and like, come on, man. It's like
nobody writes to me like that.
I see it as like a counterfeit communication. But then again, like, the quick prompts when you like just say, hey, I'll come over at 11 o'clock. See you then. Sounds good. That's but I'm kind of vetting that in a way. Like I could see that it sounds good. I'm just pressing go for it. AI. That's what I would say anyways. But when there's a large constructed like letter, and some of the voices off, you're just kind of like, I don't know.
It's almost like the uncanny valley, right? Where they talk about, like, I don't know if you know what that is, but like if it's a term used in robotics and visual effects when something looks like a robot looks close to human but not quite there. Like a lot of times we would talk about that in animation, where it looks the 3D face looks close to human but not quite there. It's kind of like off-putting. It's like, oh, okay, and it has that same kind of vibe, like it's false, it's counterfeit. But to your point, that I've had at my job, I've had offers from people who were companies that were like, hey, we'd love to help you with your 3D filmmaking, motion graphics work. Or I think it was like your scripts. And here's an example. And the script was completely obvious that it was like a ChatGPT script. And it's like, why would I pay you money to have ChatGPT write it? And it's like, there was no, and it makes you feel gross. You feel like it's very disingenuous and artificial. And there's something about that. And it's like, if that's testimony, I don't believe it, right? There's something that doesn't work with that. That's not real testimony. That's weird artificialness. So that's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting that, and I think, your paper has that aspect that is very relevant to today, even though I know you don't really talk about it directly in the paper, but it's definitely important. So I'd like to maybe go back a little bit and talk to you about a couple of things. One is a fairly common or fairly well-known thought experiment on testimony, which is the creationist teacher. And there's also the other one, which is I don't know, it's called loud. The loud party case. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So can you maybe just go over those two cases and maybe talk about what's important about those two? and
So
how it relates to your paper.
yeah, so creationist teacher is it's Lackey's kind of thought experiment, if you want to call it that, or case that example where this feeds into her statement view of testimony. So this isn't necessarily about the nature of testimony, but she's just saying that, like, she's just trying to show a counterexample to that. Testimony isn't someone who conveys their beliefs, directly from speaker to hear. You could have, say, the creationist teacher, say someone who believes in creationism, not necessarily evolution, yet to their professor, and they're in front of like an audience of university students, and they're teaching. Well, they don't believe in evolution, but they're still teaching them the theory of evolution. And so in that case, the audience can learn from about the theory of evolution, even though the professor doesn't believe in evolution themselves. So that's kind of what. And I'm trying to think like how I use that, but I was just kind of using as a backdrop in testimony, because that's Lackey's way of showing that, like, you can generate, or knowledge can generate from statements as interpreted by a hearer, even when a speaker doesn't necessarily believe in what they're saying.
So that speaks to the belief part where you were talking about earlier, where there's like you can either get testimony through someone's belief in some sense, or you get information from the content. But it seems to me that even that experiment, or that case itself, the creationist teacher may not believe the words that they're saying, but they have intent to say the story of, if you want to call it a story of evolution. She has the intent to, I guess, give that information properly as a teacher, regardless of her beliefs. So for me, it's almost like her argument doesn't really address the issue you're talking about, at least not well, because it's almost separate. Like, there's the belief part, but there's the intent to portray exactly what the textbook says. That's her job. So she intends to do that whether or not she believes it. So it's a weird feel. I feel like that doesn't really, like, her. I have read that. Well, it was a long time ago, so I'm not sure I'm doing her justice. Maybe there's some nuanced stuff that she obviously pushes that deal with intention itself, but it seems like it's still not solving or addressing the issues that you're bringing up. So I think the issues you are bringing up are definitely worth taking, definitely paying attention to on her end. So how is that different from the loud party?
So,
or how does that play into it?
So loud party. Now, there's a lot of nuance to Lackey's argument. You read that paper a long time ago too, right? The Nature of Testimony from her.
Yeah, again, it was a while ago.
There's a lot of kind of caveats or kind of patchwork to make sure that she keeps her like argument uplifted. One of the terms she talks about is non-informational expressions of thought. So, a non-informational expression of thought is like, say you and I are walking outside and it's really sunny out, and I say, "Oh, it's such a sunny day." That's a non-informational expression of thought. I'm just really kind of conveying how happy I am or how joyous I feel to be out in a sunny day. You're not getting information from me that it's sunny outside because you're also experiencing that sunny day. And so I think if I recall what I was doing at Loud Party, was like, so there's two people at a loud party. Oh God, have I jumbled this up now?
It's only a podcast. You're not actually doing the argument in writing, and this is something I've seen.
So, yeah. But basically, loud party, it'll come back to me as I explain it, but like, you could be at say you're at a party and the music's really loud, and you say to someone, the music is really loud. It's like, well, yeah,
obviously,
like the other person knows that. But that, I don't know how that feeds into my original. That's kind of like a sidebar, almost like.
Yeah, I remember.
I guess that, like, there's other things that are conveyed in that message. Like, yes, I'm actually what that person, the subtext of what that person's saying is like, well, I'm really uncomfortable. I don't think I want to be here much longer. And so I think the other person could say like, well, hey, do you want to get out of here? And it's like, yeah, let's get out of here.
So it is expressing something. It's taking it's taking content that's obvious, right? Like again, it's the words are, isn't this a loud party? But the person who's speaking it is giving, there's an intent in that, and that is, as you're saying, expressing dissatisfaction, some kind of emotion, like with the sunny day thing. It's like they're expressing an emotion, which is not something you can get just by the mere words, right? It's a sunny day. That doesn't say anything about my emotions. But using that content with an intent to a hearer, the hearer maybe picks up the intent through just the physical expressions or something, but it is trying to convey a different meaning or stronger or more complex meaning, as in, I enjoy this day because it's sunny, or I'm uncomfortable, let's get out of here. Yeah. And I think that, again, that's the importance of intent there, right? That shows, okay, well, it may be obvious, but the intent is really the important part. And the intent is to say something else. But what that brings to me is like, especially with the case of like the sunny day, is for me to, as the hearer, to pick up that intent, I have to observe, not just hear what they say. And this is where perception kind of comes in. Obviously, that's part of hearing, is part of perception. I have to hear what they say. I have to recognize the intonations. I have to recognize their expression, and all that stuff is very much observation rather than pure testimony. So I feel like I definitely agree that the intent has a huge aspect to testimony. It's super important. But with cases like that, it seems very much like there's still work that the hearer has to do. And that a lot of that work is inductive work, is making those assumptions. It's doing things that they would have to do when they're just looking at content as well. And I think maybe the difference is that the speaker is also helping you out. Is that, would you say that's correct?
And if they fall into that role of helping out the hearer, then immediately become intentional. So, right,
exactly. So there's still observation, there's still that stuff, but, and this is kind of what you're talking about, right? Regulating. The speaker has to recognize that too. Recognize, well, what does this person need to observe for them to get the meaning that I'm trying to portray? So I think that was a good example you used in your papers. Like, okay, this is explicitly saying, like, yes, obviously seems like it's just content, but actually there's a ton of stuff underneath it doing a lot of work from the speaker's end as well as the hearer's end. But I also feel like there's, I forgot what I was going to say. Something about this is just me throwing in my obligatory philosophy of mind aspect, is like, we don't necessarily know our intentions a lot of times. And a lot of that is driven by, either subconscious aspects, or, we're just not paying attention. A lot of times we do that. We go through social encounters and we're not necessarily paying attention to how we're acting or appearing, maybe because we've already been very well trained in it. And we already know the norms. This is something the paper I wrote, one of my favorite papers, deals with social norms and how that it's more like a knowledge how rather than knowledge that. So it isn't necessarily a conscious effort. We don't. And I think maybe when we get into trouble as a speaker with relaying the meaning we think we intend, that's when we're more conscious about what we're doing. But I think a lot of times we don't have that aspect at hand necessarily. We're just kind of going through the motions and saying things. And again, we don't necessarily know what we're going to say until we say it. So there's a lot of that I think has pushes back a little bit on the power of intent. It may not be, obviously it's not a deal breaker, but I'm wondering what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, I guess like what I pull out of it is like, we don't, like for loud party example, it's like, the person obviously is uncomfortable, but they don't necessarily, perhaps they kind of, they're not consciously saying that they're uncomfortable, but then the hearer has to kind of observe that. And there's this kind of there's this kind of participation and kind of, I suppose, labeling what the intent is, or drawing out the intent after the
It's almost like
fact.
they need to. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off. I'll let you finish.
No. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I guess the idea was that there's some kind of like, and you've been saying it quite a bit, that there's a play, there's a dance that they both have to participate in. So in some sense, I feel like there's maybe, whereas maybe some philosopher would say like it's the hearer, that hears whatever the hearer grabs from testimonies, what that's the most important, or whatever the speaker intends, that's the most important. But what it seems like is that their interplay is really important, because both may not be aware what they mean until they interact, and that interaction, or that particular relation. It's a big word I like to use now. That relation that they have is really what seems to help bring the meaning out. I don't know what you have to say about, but that's kind of where I feel like that was heading.
Yeah, I mean, and then if it to me is, if you go back to, if it's intention that governs testimony, or what is testimony, then yeah, I mean, the loud party case, I don't know if intention is necessarily governing that in that immediate instance, but it emerges as you're trying to make sense of that dance between both the participating speaker and hearer. So intention could be a whole other kind of, what is intention? What is, let's say, conscious intention? Yeah, that could be there's probably a whole direction you go in with that in testimony, or how I was trying to use that as governing testimony. But I still think it emerges,
Right. Yeah. It's still part of that dance, and it's extremely. I think without that, you don't have maybe testimony. But that dance, to me at least, that dance is really the important part, but an important component of the dance is, where's the intention? Yeah, cool. It's weird, just talking about it, like, just makes me think, like, cause usually when I'm caffeinated, it's just like, oh yeah, that's a really cool idea. Where does that lead? Like, so it's always fun to talk to people who are also interested in the same things. Trying to think what else. So I know maybe you don't want me to or maybe you mentioned it before, like, ultimately you felt like your argument wasn't where you wanted it to be.
No.
And you mentioned that there was some specific example that kind of like, pushed back on your argument. Is there any? Have you done any like thought about it since then, or any kind of like research, or you have any ideas that would counter it, or any ideas that you'd want to express regarding that?
I mean, so again, that counterexample is someone just looks at their watch and yells out the time, doesn't think anyone's hearing, they just yell it out for themselves. Seems like that's testimony if someone is eavesdropping on that situation, right? Have I thought about it? Yes. In depth? No. I've been recovering. My brain's been recovering from like post dissertation traumatic stress disorder. To overstate it, I suppose. And I have a baby. I have a job. I'm moving. I was looking for a job this year. It's like your brain turns to mush. But I don't know. I don't have any immediate thoughts on how I can argue against that. I mean, I suppose it's like, you don't really know if that guy says it out loud truthfully, but he probably does. No one has the motivation to just state the time to themselves out loud. There's some like weird, awkward, meaning that doesn't attend to like what they state out loud. So
what would you say about somebody who's like, because a lot of times I do this, and maybe it's annoying to people, but I will talk to myself And I kind of, in some sense, the same way I would talk to somebody else. Like I have an intention to say something and mean something for me to hear it and understand it. It's almost like I'm giving myself information, um, and I'm trying to convey a certain meaning through the words I'm saying. Maybe I don't know what that is yet because I'm working it out. But I feel like there's still an element of intention involved when someone's talking to themselves. So there's intention there, which maybe we'll say that's correct. Whether there's a here or way over here that gets it, yeah, there's no real regulation of conveying that to that person. So yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I like it sounds like rehearsal, right? Yeah, I do talk to myself a lot because I'm trying to like string a bunch of ideas together, or even if I'm like mad at someone in my life, family, friend, work, um, I you have these thoughts, and sometimes they just kind of come out loud, and you just kind of like you have to kind of get it out, but it's almost like rehearsal if you had the big event where you had to like talk to somebody about something. It's like if you give a speech, you rehearse it at home in the mirror, just say, or like with your cue cards, and speak to your dog. But you're not. Are you giving a speech or rehearsing a speech? I don't know. So, is it rehearsal of testimony? No, it's not. I mean, again, the watch example is it's a pretty tough blow to what was arguing. I guess like I mentioned, I think before recording that there is definitely a knockdown argument I have against her, at least in the realm of here testimony, because she talks about acts of communication. She doesn't talk about just speaking or writing. To her, an act of communication could be like a gesture. It could be like a nod towards something, pointing. And so she includes this term acts of communication in her here testimony disjunct. And I just kind of like, and I actually do kind of mention this in the paper as kind of a side note, that it'd be odd if someone were to gesture to themselves, and only to themselves, something like you can't wave to yourself, or you can't like, I don't know, you can't point to, like, I'll give you an example of what it is to gesture intentionally. Okay. So like, this is Lackey's example where it's like, if someone asks you, hey, is it raining outside? And you nod towards the umbrella in the corner, you're acknowledging indirectly that it's raining outside. And then additionally, you should probably take the umbrella with you, right? I can't think of people who like gesture to themselves in some kind of subtextual kind of way. And that's what acts of communication are. So she could have just used direct speech or direct in writing in some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, like if I wanted to know if it was raining, I wouldn't be able. Obviously, if I didn't know, I wouldn't know the umbrella was there, right? I wouldn't be able to nod to myself. Look, John, the umbrella's over there. That definitely seems. I mean, maybe for a comical thing, that's something somebody would write, but I definitely don't see that as an actual common thing to do. Yeah, so that's interesting because I noticed while I'm listening that I'm nodding, but I'm not sure I'm doing that again, like unconsciously until I see it, and I'm wondering, am I doing that for myself or am I doing that for you, or is it something that we've trained ourselves socially to do to let the other person acknowledge to the person that I'm listening. You know what I mean? And that's something that I'm not sure where that lands. So I think there's some play there that we could look at. Whether or not that defends Lackey or not, I'm not sure. But I think there's some ambiguity there. And I think just for me, maybe I'm fixated on the idea that like we don't know a lot of what we do. So then a lot of things that we try to intend may not actually. We may not know what they are, or what we may not intend as much as we think we do, at least not consciously.
Yeah, I think just on that last point, I think you're in kind of like auto mode or auto play with nodding because it's such a social convention, right? Just to show that you're acknowledging that you're listening and that you're receiving my ideas. So even though you're not conscious of it, and I think a lot of people like can speak, I don't like intentionally think about every word that's coming out of my mouth when I'm speaking. Although, to be honest, I'm kind of like that. Yeah, but there are people that just kind of ramble and um, they're kind of relying on some kind of auto mode, for lack of a good word term, for lack of a better term for that. But um, so yeah, but is it intentional? Because you're only noticing it after the fact. You're not intentionally nodding. So, um, but it seems intentional to me.
And if I was shaking my head, even though I knew I was trying to signal that I did understand, I would be like, "Wait, what am I doing that for?" There would be a regulation there, right?
Yeah.
If I did something that was not normal, a normal convention thing, and I recognize that, I would regulate that. That's not what I intended. That's not the intention I'm having.
No, unless we had an agreed upon convention that no means yes, yes means no.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are some cultures where certain gestures are different, and that's an interesting thing to see and to navigate for sure.
And to misread what people are doing, and then just having all kinds of fallout just because. Yeah.
So I guess next question I have for you is: if you could write the dissertation again, would you do the same one? Would you do a modification of it? Like modified topic, not necessarily improving the paper, but in terms of a slightly different topic, or would you go for something completely different?
Yeah, I have two answers for this. To get a better mark, because I ended up with a high merit, like 68.
I know.
I would have done something a little more boring and just kind of attack the active communication label that she puts in for the here testimony, the one I just kind of talked about. And I think that what I would have done is agreed with her still that yes, it's the disjunctive nature to testimony, but the here testimony side of it needs a little bit of this patchwork. It's not an act testimony, it's direct speech or something like that. But that's not interesting. Like, yeah, I mean, I guess what I struggle with in like studying philosophy is that idea, like, and I agree with it. Like, we should be really well trained and like really narrowing on one little thing and just letting things flow from there. Right. It probably took me the whole master's to figure that out. I knew it.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to figure out for sure.
Yeah, because you have these big lofty, I'm going to change this whole aspect of philosophy and I'm going to change the world kind of thing. And it's just like, no, just zero in on this one little thing and let's see if something interesting will kind of like break apart from there. And then you have your 3,000 word paper. Or you have your 8,000, 10,000 word paper. So yeah, but yeah, I still would have done, I'm still interested in intention and testimony, that bigger thing, because I do think it relates to, there's a lot of what language does for us socially and how we should like probably make sense of what that looks like compared to what it might look like artificially. So yeah, I would still, if I were to rewrite it just for the sake of the exercise of writing dissertation, it would have kind of narrowed my view, not try to attack it with intention, about speaker intention. But then again, maybe if I had more time, I would just explore it, and a year later I'd have a better argument for the position that I'm trying to argue. So that's my answer, kind of long-winded answer. Yeah.
Have you thought about like taking it further and doing that exact thing, taking a year to just think about it and then get it ready for publication? Because I know there's some encouragement from some of the advisors I've had that were like, not from me particularly, but in general, like everybody should, be encouraged to publish or try to publish what they have. Or
I mean, it's a thought.
Publish something.
It's an ambitious thought. I think it requires a lot of gumption to like revisit a paper and just kind of revamp the whole thing. Also like, a family, have a job, and like my wife is was very supportive and patient with this whole project of mine that took 3 years, And although it's life changing for me, like I just absolutely love philosophy. It is a labor, though. It's laborious what you have to go through to get something good. And for me, someone who I don't have very fast or clear processes. I think it takes me longer than most other people because I'm always thinking broad, but I'm trying to narrow that in some kind of analytical sense, right? So I'd like to. It's a thought that's there. It's not something I'm entertaining at the moment. I also thought, would I continue into PhD philosophy? Someone asked me that the other day, and I was like, it's so hard. I don't know. Like, I'm more interested in kind of media studies kind of stuff. But then is that easier? I don't know. So I don't want to, anything with studies attached to the end of it.
Right.
but I'm also interested in like science, technology, and society kind of stuff, which, I don't know.
It sounds like there's always room for philosophy in those pursuits as well,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, but there's more, I suppose, a bit more of a practical, you could broaden your audience a bit as well. Like philosophy it's hard to find people to engage with in philosophy. So, yeah. How about yourself? Like,
yeah. I have another kid coming, and I'm in debt in terms of the time I've taken to do these things like you. So there's a lot of backtracking, take a step back. I ultimately, at some point, yes, that would be pursuing like a PhD or a publication would be something I would like to do, but it is time to kind of, as you're saying, take a break and process it all in some sense, and see where that goes. But I always have the fear that, like, of being left out of that common phrase, like the fear of being left out of it and trying to come back in and being like, what is this? I don't know what's going on. But there are a lot of important things, that need to be paid attention to. So, but yeah, at some point, I'll definitely be doing that. If it's one of those things where it's like I have 15 minutes every day to think about something, I'll take it. Because it is, as you're saying, it was life changing. It's a very huge part of my life, I guess, in some sense, just mentally, and it's fulfilling for sure. More so than some of the other pursuits I've had when I was younger, like filmmaking and stuff like that. I think that's still a big part of me, but it's not. It just feels like inaccessible now. Like filmmaking, it's just you can't do it. It's without a lot of money. You can't do it without a lot of time and a sacrifice. And with philosophy, at least you can read it, right? And you can, you got a lunch break. I can read this and stay informed in some sense and feel satisfied from that. So, and
it always just brings you to the edges of things, right? Like, it's constantly like, my thesis advisor, he has a website, or he was interviewed an article, but he just said it really well. I'll paraphrase it. I won't say it directly, but it's something like, what he loves about philosophy is like it addresses things that we turn away from, but we turn away from them because like they're incomprehensible. We can't bear it, so we just kind of accept it. But what philosophy does is it kind of like addresses these things in clear and principled ways. And so the idea being that like we're always operating these concepts that are just unrefined, and people just kind of like accept them. Like you think about ethics and our notions of knowledge, and then more in your area, like philosophy of mind, like it's just such an interesting topic now, because can minds emerge from artificial things, from silicon? Yeah.
And they're all addressing relevant things about society, right? Obviously, epistemology and ethics, and philosophy of mind as well. And especially now, I feel like they're all kind of really, really kind of merging, because you have epistemology, like, what can we know? Can other things know that aren't human or life forms? And like, what do we do about this ethically? And Yeah, as you're saying, it's like you're able, philosophy helps you conceptualize in a rigid form, or at least a clear form. And at the same time, it also like is skeptical of its own form, of its own um, formulation of things. So, which is really cool. I like that part. I missed that part actually. I think we had maybe one course was like, I don't know if you were. I think you were in it. Like philosophical methods. It may have been the first course. I don't remember. But for me, it was fantastic because it was like, how do you know that like literally, how do you know your philosophical methods are the right ones to use for this? And so it's one of those. It's very much like science in some sense, how it's quote unquote self-correcting, and it helps it it's aware of itself. It does the same thing. This part of philosophy is incomprehensible. Well, we need to break it down and make it more understandable and clearer. And ultimately, oh, that's actually something we should reject. Like that, I think is great.
But then it's like, even in that pursuit, which ultimately gets rejected, there's such a rich breadth of exploration that happened, and the landscape is still there. So it's always kind of expanding. I mean, to me, that's how it seems. But you do seem like a lot of philosophers that I read, or even some of them, like some professors you've had, they just feel like philosophy is at this kind of dead end, and I just don't see it. Like, maybe for them because they're so deep in their kind of sub-discipline of philosophy, but like, they don't, I don't know if they realize that like the general public doesn't have this access to like seeing things the way you see them. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, and I think that's more of a problem with society. I'm a very big defender of philosophy. Like, I think if everybody was walking around analyzing things, or analyzing their analyzing, to some extent, obviously there's other things that need to be there as well, like connecting emotionally and things like that. They're very important. I really feel like things would be better off. I mean, I know there's been like some surveys where they take philosophers or people in certain professions, specifically ethics, I think, where they went ahead and they gave them like ethical situations, and they did no better. Like, ethicists did no better than the average person in terms of ethics. So and I see that as that's more or less because of the way society pressures people to do things and to act. And when you're sitting in a chair by yourself and you're delving into the philosophy, it's like a safe place. You can do this. You can think about it. And when you're out in the real world, and I remember hearing you talk about like sometimes you're the pest in your work, because sometimes you'll sit down at a meeting and be like, have you guys really thought about this conceptually? This doesn't seem like, and I think that's perfectly valid to do, right? It's comes from I'm assuming an earnest place, and you're trying to better things, and sometimes people don't want to hear that. As you're saying, like they just want to take the definition as it is commonly understood. And so I definitely think society plays a part in that sense of dead end.
Right. I mean, everything needs to be measurable or expedient, productive in some way. It needs to have an instant consequence kind of thing, and an ends to a means to an end, ends to and to be honest, like I find in education, like I feel education's at a dead end right now. They certainly in education, we don't know what to do with this. Like, just go on LinkedIn. I follow so many kind of education people, like AI. Oh my God, what's AI going to do to us? And it's just like, well, we're still thinking human beings separate from AI, and we're going to have to. So part of me thinks like, if say, part of me thinks that we have to just teach people how to think, and maybe a philosophizing society will be able to like manage all this kind of like digital architecture that's being built around us to like kind of seduce us into deferring our cognitive work for it. And but schools can be a place where people just sit and think about things that AI can't do. And
right. And even if they could do it, in all honesty, even if they could do it, I wouldn't want them to take that away from me, right? fine. You can do it. You're a wonderful sentient machine that can do all kinds of amazing godlike things. I don't care. I want to do this. I want to think. I want to think through things like that. That to me is a part of being human, right? It's a part of that whole humanity. And I feel like that's, yeah, people are too enamored by the result. The result. What's this going to do for me? Yeah, so I feel like I have the same intuitions as you do regarding that. But it'd be fun to see a whole society just philosophizing all the time.
While AI creates its own art and novels and
sure, and we can acknowledge it and we can say that's really cool. I'm going to do mine. And actually, one of the things I think could be a consequence of a lot of AI taking our jobs. Because certainly in my field, that's going to happen within 10 years, if not sooner. The idea is that things like live music, real painting, like seeing maybe somebody actually paint live or seeing their actual painting, more sociality or social connection, live social connection will probably take place, or at least that will never go away. Like you'll still have people playing music on instruments. There'll be plays, maybe not so much movies because that can be done digitally. There'll be digital stars and all that stuff now, but there'll be plays and where there are real people. You're seeing real people act and do things in a scenario, and I think I'm going to take a positive spin on this and say like that's maybe something that will become stronger. When was the last time anybody's seen a play? Like it's been a while for me at least, and like that kind of things. Or seen live music. I'm obviously a little secluded here, but because I have 1.5 kids, one kid on the way. But I think those kind of things will become more common, and hopefully that's a good thing.
Yeah, I still think it'll hold a lot of currency, or we'll have an urge to just stay that connection because I don't know. There's something social connection is important to us. To most people anyways. Few people are hermits, and if society forces us to become hermitized in some way, which it is now, like a lot of people feel lack of connection to others, right? Because they're just constantly with their electronics. So this urge to create, I think, is something about humanity creating and making art. That's something that we still going to want to do. We'll think it's cool what AI does, but yeah, I don't know. So
yeah, I assume we probably will have more avenues for creating, but I definitely I would hate to have that taken away from me. Like, oh, I want to make a movie. AI, press the button, does it for you. That's like, what's the point of wanting to make a movie if you're just pressing a button? Like, there's something weird about that. Like,
yeah.
It's almost like intention is important.
Well, gotcha. There you go. You find it around. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of questions that come out of this. I think as the testimony is just a part of that for me, but yeah, certainly like what's kind of the right way to live, going back to kind of normative ethics. What's the right way to speak? What's the right way to interact with people? So yeah.
Cool. So before we go, because it probably it's about time for me to get back to the the non-philosophical aspect of life. Is there anything else you want to say? Any other particular ideas in philosophy that you just want to like throw out that you're interested in? I mean, you just mentioned normative ethics. Anything at all going on that you're interested in mentioning before we leave?
I wouldn't say so much. And like, I'm starting to think a bit more about education again. A hot button topic is computational thinking. And I'm quite like interested in philosophy of science still. And like whether, when you generalize things to induction, just say, I just like, I'm interested in kind of teaching kids how to think a little more philosophically in a way that's pitched at their level. But in terms of big questions, man, I have so many random interests that come and go. Like it's trying to think though. I have downloaded all the lectures for philosophy of mind. I don't know if I'm supposed to do that, but kind of some of the old ones from Edinburgh. But so I plan to kind of like going back into philosophy of mind, even though I never actually studied it in the program. But so I suppose if there's another philosophical interest, it's still philosophy of mind. I just kind of got hooked into epistemology and ethics for some reason.
So what about philosophy of mind got you into it in the first place? Kind of, I think that was the avenue into philosophy. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I know we're kind of asking this at the end of the book.
Yeah, that's like honestly, like that's one of the original things that got me into it was, I think like, is it dualism? Like is it like the Cartesian dualism? Like, is there immaterial things, or is there an immaterial world, or is everything physical? And most philosophy might say that it is. I'm not sure where you lie. What camp you lie?
I remain. I definitely don't think dualism is correct, but I remain agnostic about a lot of other details like panpsychism, and everything's just material, and we're looking at it from the wrong perspective, kind of like a Denishian view. He's where I became interested in philosophy in some sense. So I still hold some of that up fairly high, but I'm not quite sure I'm convinced anymore. So there's so many nuanced aspects to that I basically remain a student. Like, which ones? They all seem really interesting. They're all really, really compelling arguments, and also big holes in many of them. So it's kind of like, other than dualism, I remain fairly agnostic. I'm certain I'm a materialist in the sense that I don't think there's anything well, here's the thing. As you know, in philosophy of science, like, you have to question what is matter, what is all this stuff, and like, if matter isn't what we think it is, then what is materialism? So there's a whole world out there. Again, like, come on back. There's plenty to work on.
Yeah, I mean, it's sure. Does the mind emerge from the brain, kind of thing? When you say Denishian, you mean Dennett, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I read his. Is it The Conscious Mind? I read that book.
He has several. I'm not sure that's the title. He had Consciousness Explained. That was his 91.
And maybe that's the one, 91. I mean, I read the book. I know well before. I mean, and I read it. I didn't study it. So there's a lot that I missed. But his like whole thing is like, to him is like, we're just taking so many sensory inputs, and stuff that kind of bubbles to the top is what your kind of view is, your conscientious view, what the mind is.
Your conscious experience is as you're saying, like, there's a bunch of information, and this part that gets voted on as being general for everything is something to that accord. It's been a while since I've delved into his work, but I think his most significant work is not necessarily, it's definitely significant, but his articles, I think, are really powerful. Like, he's several articles that really are just catalyze a lot of thought on philosophy of mind, and in general, like, pretty strong in terms of the argument. I think his book is pretty good, but it's also somewhat for the lay person as well, so it doesn't get into the real strong argumentation.
Right.
But things like one of my favorites is his real patterns, and there's many ways to interpret that, apparently, but I really liked the way I understand it. I thought that was a really good paper to look into, and that delves into epistemology in some sense.
Yeah, I read that one as well. I have no idea now what it was about, but I'll have to revisit that one. But in Phil Mind 1 and Phil Mind 2, is there like an area that really stuck out to you that was interesting?
That's a good question. I mean, it was all very interesting, but it was all very, as you're saying, kind of not so broad, very narrow into specific parts. Like, again, my specific dissertation was on a relational account of joint attention, and how where does the mind fit in there? There were so many different aspects, just like animal minds, things like that was another one, which is really interesting. Like, because there's cognitive science, or the idea that an animal can have this, we can use the same folk psychological terms that we use for humans on animals, and there's a lot of pushback on that in the scientific community, because like, well, we can say the animal sees and understands this, but is that what really is happening? And so I did a paper siding with the fact that we can't say those terms, but I'm a really big fan of like removing ourselves from folk psychological terminology. So there's folk psychological terminology, just like using things like belief, desire, and all these things, which just don't really work when you get into the nitty gritty mechanisms of the neuroscientific aspect of it. It may work to some extent in psychology, like in clinical psychology and things like that, but not, I feel like it still doesn't do a good enough job there. And I'm not necessarily a limited materialist, which is kind of the polar opposite, which is everything needs to be like data and statistics, and we need to speak to people that way in some sense. Yeah. But I definitely, my intuition lies more closely to that in some sense. But there's a whole world of like philosophy of mind stuff. I mean, whether it's, as you're saying, like computation is how we actually think. Are we computational in terms of the way we think? Are we representational as we think, for thinking? Those two things. And now the big one is like embodied cognitive process, which is kind of like process theory of biology. Instead of like, here's a mental state, you only have processes. There's no static anything, and you can't judge anything based off of a state because it's underdeterministic or overdeterministic. So there's all these things that revolve around mind that are also very closely linked to philosophy of science, right? And so that's something I like a lot too, is philosophy of science. I think for me, it's hard to break those apart in many ways, because because my intuitions do lie mostly with like kind of more of a scientific view and understanding of the brain and our behavior and things like that. So for me, that's, I don't necessarily think computational thought is necessarily how we work. And by computational, I mean like, maybe you know this too, like in the past, it's been very, very Fodorian in terms of von Neumann computer architecture represents how the brain works. And we know that's just not the case at all. Right. But we still use that a lot. And even in scientific experiments, we still use that terminology. We still kind of have that intuition. And that's something that nowadays is becoming less and less popular. People are pushing towards a more processual way of thinking about, the movement of neurons and brain mechanisms. And so there's that aspect. I mean, I could go on for hours about all this. So
yeah, you did mention to me like you're into process philosophy? Process
philosophy is, I think it started probably way, way, way back, but the most common Western version of it is Alfred Whitehead's version of process theory, and then it's developed since then. And right now I've been reading a process of biology book. Process theory of biology, and that's really interesting. It's basically saying, instead of breaking things down in terms of like, this is an object, and then this is the thing the objects do. Everything's like, this is a process. Like if I stand still, I'm still doing things. My body is still doing things. My brain is still doing things. There's no static still moment. And you can look at physics and you'll come up with similar things. There's nothing that's not moving. And so it's kind of based off of that.
So like some kind of harmony with the environment, that it's just all one big process kind of thing. And that takes out
you can certainly take it that far. And I think if I did something like that myself intuitively, I would probably still try to align myself with some of the scientific aspects of that. So it wouldn't be too fluffery, like, for a better word. I mean, probably need a less offensive version of that word, but where it's not too mystical. It's more grounded in hard ontology. What is really happening? And maybe we don't have the epistemology. Maybe the epistemology and ontology differ enough where we'll never get to what's really happening. And that's always a fun thing to talk about too, is like the epistemology and science, and how, because I think we we're enamored somewhat about some of the difference between realism and anti-realism and stuff like that. So there's a lot of that plays into process theory as well.
Okay. So, I mean, I would say I'm definitely not more of an instrumentalist. Like, science is a good tool. We don't necessarily have access to reality, um, whatever that is, you know. So process theory is probably, I'm guessing,
it's a conceptualization that would, in some sense, for some people, it's a conceptualization that gets us closer to the real, if you will. So it's something where like what we use now is outdated. It only gets us so far in terms of getting closer to what's really out there, and hitting that part. And I think that's what I like about it. It's like, actually, we should be defining things this way because it's closer to reality. Maybe not exactly, but it seems to do a better job.
And it can be empirically verified in some way, like.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very. Yeah. There's a lot of scientific aspects to it. It's like just the idea of like homeostasis. They use dynamic systems theory. They'll use things like thermodynamics, entropy, and all of that stuff really lends itself to movement and motion. If you look at astrophysics and things like quantum field theory, probably has some aspects of that. Just that space itself is never still; it's always fluctuating and moving. So there's a lot of that involved in it. But it all kind of originated, at least the modern part, kind of originated from Whitehead's notion. I haven't read his paper, but I've heard other people speak specifically about it. I don't think it's a paper, maybe it's a book, but it's something that's my next step, is to go back. I'm very adverse to looking at old stuff because there's so much new stuff coming out, but I think it's important in this case to do that. So
where I get lost, like a lot of science terminology just derails my understanding. And that's why I get fearful. I love philosophy of science because it interrogates science, which makes it stronger, I think.
Yeah, I like that aspect too, because that's kind of what philosophy does. There's nothing that it can't interrogate, right? Yeah. Including itself.
But then it's interrogating a lot of these terms like, antimatter or dark energy stuff. Like I got lost in that stuff, like that kind of astro.
To me, it was the math. The math is just like, like I took calculus in college and was okay with it, but it's the math that's like a lot. It was funny because a lot of like scientists, like I don't understand, if I can't get a hold of the math, I don't understand it. Right. And that's scary because like I will never understand it then because I can't grasp like differential equations. And I probably could if I spent a lot of time, because I do like it. It's challenging for a lot of people. So it's like there's that fear of, okay, I have to understand this math. However, a lot of stuff for the biological aspect uses like simple thermodynamic equations, and like what am I thinking? Probability theory, like Bayesian probability theory. So those are fairly easy to pick up and get. Yeah. Some of the other stuff though is just like, nope. Like dynamic systems, that stuff is hard to grasp mathematically. And a lot again, the problem is, as you know, is like a lot of the way communicating is through metaphor. Metaphors don't always hit properly. So it's something that's like you kind of have to know the math in many ways.
All right, man.
Cool. Well, thanks for doing this. I hope it wasn't boring. It was definitely fun and insightful for me, especially the whole idea of intention. I did read the paper, but I feel like you explained the importance of it to me here very well. So I was like, oh, that's a really good point. I'm going to start looking back at it and thinking about that more, because I think, it is an important aspect of testimony if you think about it.
I think so. And by my own standards, I don't think I conveyed that very well in the paper, but given running up my runway. But
I actually really enjoyed the paper. And I felt like the beginning stuff, you really break everything down and you just follow it. And honestly, truthfully, it made me want to keep reading it. I'm like, oh, okay, this is cool. And you get to some of the examples. So it was definitely well organized. And I feel like, I think you did a good job on it, honestly.
Thanks, man. Yeah. Well, I actually felt like I had a good kind of start for sure. I just didn't, in the end, like what you're shooting for. I felt like I just what you're shooting for is like, I don't know how to do this I just missed the mark a little bit, you know? So yeah, if I were to revisit it, I would, the thing is you got to redraft. I could probably redraft it a few more times.
I felt the same way with mine. Like there's definitely, and that's the thing. It's like we have families. We don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
But kudos, man. You did a great job. And with what little time you had, that's impressive, right? That's definitely.
Right. Well, I appreciate talking about it because, it's emerging from the grave again now. It's all down. Go home and I'm going to be up all night. I have to call in sick tomorrow because I'm not going to sleep.
Nice. I hope it didn't cause too much post-traumatic stress.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I loved doing this because I don't get to. I have people that are into my life that are interested. Like I gave my paper to my vice principal, who's interested in philosophy, but doesn't he's into like Stoic philosophy kind of thing, right?
Okay.
So it's so I kind of like try to give him some resources on normative ethics. Think about utilitarianism or consequentialism, Kantian deontology kind of stuff, virtue ethics. So I don't know if he's going to dig into it. And I gave my paper. I said, good luck with that. But, it's such a like a love of mine. So I appreciate the opportunity to just to talk about it. And it's something I could do it for another hour probably.
Yeah, me too. I mean, all honesty, I'll definitely check back in and do another one and see where you are, what you're interested in, what you're doing. Again, for sure. So just keep that in mind. Recurring guests are great.
Before we, you asked me. Actually, one area I'm interested in is this notion of epistemic well-being. So I plan to write a blog about this. So I don't know why I didn't mention that before, but I've started. My blog is philsciedu.com. I can send it to you.
Yeah, please do.
But I've not really done any kind of writing in this area yet. It's laid dormant for 2 months. But my notion of epistemic well-being is just the idea that about what does this, how do I say it, society, knowledge, and a knowledgeable society. This is kind of a concept I want to explore. So I don't know if that's necessarily philosophy or anthropology or I don't know, but I'll send it.
Because in terms of whether or not a knowledgeable society is a happy, fit society, in that kind of sense?
Something like that.
Or how to do that?
Yeah.
That sounds philosophical.
Yeah.
Also practical, which is, well, I don't know if it's practical, but it's definitely
No, I think it is, which makes me wonder how philosophical it is, or if it's just kind of sociological in some way. But anyways. So
cool. Yeah. Send me the link and I'll include it in the show notes, as they say. So.
Okay. And it's totally uninvolved. It's just the starting. So,
no worries.
Take away at it. Yeah. Okay, man.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for doing this. Appreciate it.
All right.
All right.
Talk to you soon.